Meet Kwame Nkrumah, the man the Akon people of Ghana call Osagyefo, or in English, the Redeemer. US National Security Advisor Robert Blowtorch Comer knew him as the man who did more to undermine American interests than any other black African. Kwame Nkrumah was a man who put the fear of God into America and the West, and had the FBI, MI6 and the CIA all breaking out in night sweats. So who was this Hannibal of West Africa, and why did America and the West fear him so much? Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana and the man who single-handedly tore Ghana away from British imperialist clutches in the 1950s. Born into a poor family, the future president was the ninth of many children. We don't actually know how many. His father, who had many wives, was often not home, choosing instead to work on his goldsmithing business, until he died in 1927. But none of this could stop the unbelievably determined Kwame, who when he was 16 was already being paid to teach at his secondary school. Later, Deputy Headmaster James Agri of the prestigious Attribution school where Nkrumah was training to be a professional teacher, introduced him to the teachings of the Pan-African giant Jamaica's Marcus Garvey and American civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois. As a fully qualified teacher, and after meeting Nigerian activist and future first president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Nkrumah decided to take his advice and head to America to study. In 1935, Nkrumah landed in America. Now, he might have looked around him and seen the bright lights of New York City and the slick roads and tall buildings and been tempted to forget all his studious intentions and instead make like any other student in the history of students and live it up and party hard. But then news got to America that Italy had invaded Ethiopia, and if it wasn't before, everything just got personal. Ethiopia was the symbol of African freedom and sovereignty at the time. It could boast that no European power had ever successfully invaded it. Ethiopia, since the time of the ancient Greeks, had represented Africa to the world, and now that was under threat too. For Nkrumah, change in Africa couldn't come soon enough, so in America, he got to work. Nkrumah becomes a desperate political Ronin and wanders the streets of Harlem throughout the 1930s, learning from revolutionaries and speakers like Carlos Cook and meeting famous Marxists like C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, and Chinese-American Grace Lee Boggs. And this is where Marika Sherwood says in her book Kwame Nkrumah: The Years Abroad that the FBI started to pay attention. These were huge names in the revolutionary scene in America, people who wanted change and an end to what they saw as a corrupt and morally bankrupt political system. And Nkrumah was moving in these dangerous circles. So began the wiretaps and the opening of letters and the stalking. Now, did Nkrumah's ears start to burn? Did he know of the surveillance? Had someone tipped him off? Or was he just bored and felt the time had come to leave America? We don't quite know, but we do know that in 1944 Nkrumah packed his bags and sailed for England. But Nkrumah spent little time in England. He returned to Ghana from Liverpool in 1947. And once in Ghana, trouble seemed to follow Nkrumah everywhere. Protests got him noticed by the British authorities. Just a year after his return, Nkrumah led a march that turned into a nationwide riot and was put in jail by the British colonial authorities in Ghana. He was soon released though. So, Nkrumah decides to do something completely different. He uses his popularity to start his own media organization, the Accra Evening News. Now, it seems here that Nkrumah had learned a thing or two from his days in Europe and America. Soon after founding this newspaper, Nkrumah formed the Radical Committee on Youth Organization, the CYO, with the no-nonsense motto of self-government now. Before Nkrumah was ever the Redeemer, he was first Nkrumah the Restless. He couldn't stand the conventional parties in Ghana and their moderate snail-like approach of one step at a time towards independence. To him, they seemed like controlled opposition. So what did he do? He left and formed his own party altogether called the Convention People's Party. Now here's where Nkrumah's genius comes into play, and his enemies might have greatly underestimated him. Listen to what an FBI informant had to say about Nkrumah back in his America days. He, quote, lacked leadership on the campus and had not shown initiative, and he is not an independent thinker, close quote. The West was about to be sorely mistaken, because in 1949, after forming the CPP, Nkrumah did something in Ghana that no West African revolutionary fighting for independence had ever done before. He abandoned the high and mighty, the well-heeled and rich upper classes of Ghanaian society and started targeting the everyday man, the worker, the poor, the youth. Just a quick pause here. It's worth stressing just how big a deal this was. You see, all across Africa, particularly West Africa, the thing about the fight to gain independence was that, well, it wasn't much of a fight. It was more of a pleasant fireside chat with Beethoven oozing from a gramophone on the sideboard, whereas Nkrumah favoured strikes, riots, and high life. Before Nkrumah, independence in West Africa was the chit-chat of the movers and shakers of Black African society, the well-heeled lawyers, doctors, and engineers who had studied in Europe. At the time, the thinking seemed logical and obvious. You want to change society and show your colonial masters that you are their equal and should be allowed to govern yourself? Well then, get the black middle and upper classes on your side and get them to show just how cultured and how civilized you can be. And they might then see that you deserve to run your own country. Nkrumah thought there was something, well, yes massa, no massa, about this. To him, Africans didn't need permission to govern themselves, and the rich and educated of African society alone should not be the ones to dictate the people's destiny. Nkrumah saw that true power was with the 99%, and Nkrumah went straight for them. His party, the CPP, mobilized the youth, drove vans festooned in the party's red, white, and green colors across the country, playing music and rallying the masses. The type of people members of his old party probably saw as the rabble. The result? Ghana gave Nkrumah her heart. His popularity with the people soon made him not unstoppable, but inevitable. This was a sea change, a game changer. But the British were watching, and they weren't about to let go of Ghana just because of some protests and a few riots here and there. You don't come to own the largest empire the world had ever seen by packing up and going home at the first sight of a challenge. Oh no. The British next did what the British Empire did best: divide and conquer, or at least they tried to. The colonial government opened negotiations with other leaders of the independence movement, whose names weren't Nkrumah, with promises of greater power and funding, aka bribes. What does Nkrumah do? Sounds the alarm. He called for strikes up and down Ghana, strikes which led to more violence in 1950. Again, Nkrumah was arrested and sent to jail. But like many that would come after him, jail could not hold Nkrumah. In 1951, from a jail cell and using toilet paper to pass on notes to his supporters outside, Nkrumah's party won the parliamentary elections, and the British were forced to free Nkrumah. And once again, Nkrumah wasted no time. As leader of the largest Black African party in the Ghanaian parliament, he wrestled concessions from the British, getting them to use Ghana's revenues from cocoa and other natural resources to reinvest in the Ghanaian economy. Things were going well, but the whole time British intelligence MI5 kept a close tab on Nkrumah and his associates, wiretapping, reading letters, and using informers from within his circle. None of this was new to Nkrumah, of course. In 1954, an all-African parliament is elected for the first time in Ghana, and finally in 1956, the British gave in after new elections held to determine the popularity of the independence question went against them. Nkrumah's CPP won the day, and a date was set for freedom. That date came on March the 6th, 1957. It's on that day that Nkrumah gave his famous speech,
Long blood, the battle has ended.
This was a monumental moment in the history of modern Black Africa, because over the next few years, other Black African nations would fall like dominoes to the wave of self-government. This was no joke. It was as if Ghana had opened the floodgates. In the next 4 years, here are just a few of the countries Britain, France, and other European powers would let go: Guinea, Cameroon, Senegal, Togo, Mali, Madagascar, Congo, Somalia, Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, and of course, Nigeria. So, what next for Ghana after blazing the trail for Africa? At this point, given the recent history of African states, you might be expecting that Nkrumah gained power and Ghana went down the tube economically, became a basket case, banana republic, same old story that we've become used to when it comes to Africa, right? Wrong. Nkrumah sees that his new nation has many different tribes and smaller nations within it, and predicts Western powers using this against Ghana. So he moves immediately to heavily promote a one nation concept. He bans tribal flags being flown anywhere in the country. Very much overkill, but most Ghanaians just ignore this law anyway. It's Nkrumah's foresight here that's amazing when you consider what's happened in the Sudan, Biafra, Rwanda, Congo, and the list just goes on. Next, Nkrumah makes primary education compulsory for every child. He subsidizes and gives tax breaks to private employers actively training and giving apprenticeships to young men in industry. And in a heavily patriarchal society, Nkrumah does something different. He moves women to key positions within the CPP party and passes laws reserving certain positions in parliament only for women. He encourages more Ghanaian women to attend university and subsidizes cooperative incentives for women traders. Then there's the huge Asokombo Dam completed in 1966, creating a groundswell of jobs. Program after program, Nkrumah attempts to industrialize Ghana. Call it a chip on his shoulder, whatever you call it, Osagyefo was determined to prove that African nations could do whatever European nations could. And at least economically, he was successful. Ghana's GDP exploded, soared, and the young nation was happy. But Nkrumah was making enemies. You see, Nkrumah had been naive enough to believe that on March the 6th, 1957, Ghana had gained its independence for good. Goodbye colonial powers, see you on the playing field of equality. But Nkrumah was a fast learner, and what he quickly realized was that the West had a contingency plan in place for the post-colonial era. Nkrumah described this plan as neo-colonialism, a term everybody uses freely today. Not bad for a supposedly poor intellect. And Nkrumah defined neo-colonialism as a state of affairs in which Western nations maintain power over Africa, quote, without responsibility, and for those who suffer it, it means exploitation without redress, close quote. So when Nkrumah decided to raise taxes on a British company, Ashanti Goldfields, which were making huge profits from paying Ghanaian labourers pennies on the pound for their work, guess who had Nkrumah in their sights? Yup, the old enemy. As if the British weren't enough for enemies, Nkrumah was also busy making enemies of America. The CIA was furiously typing back and forth memoranda about how Nkrumah was working tirelessly to, quote, export his brand of nationalism throughout Africa. Nkrumah at the time was calling for a united Africa, what some call Pan-Africanism, the view that Africa should unite economically and politically under one banner, a little like the EU. This way, African nations would be stronger to take on outside manipulators and extortioners. Little known fact is that before the EU was ever formed, the idea on which it was based, the common market, was supposed to include African nations as well. Nkrumah's rallying cry throughout Africa at the time was, hold on a minute, don't get played again Africa, a deal with Europe is a rigged deal. And it worked. African nations backed away from the idea, leaving the common markets to become a Europe-only program. Long before it became a popular cause in the West, Nkrumah was funding blacks in South Africa fighting against the unjust apartheid regime. And maybe most importantly, Nkrumah was also a real pain in the Congo, the most resource-rich region in the whole of Africa, maybe the world. There, he funded anti-Western factions in the country's civil war. This is where a lot of people started getting very uneasy. This little man the FBI thought wasn't that intelligent, and that the British thought wouldn't give them that much trouble, was doing just that. John Stockwell, a former CIA man, came out in the 1980s and whistle blew on a lot of the CIA's dealings across the world. And one of the things he exposed was that around about 1964, a plan was being hatched between Britain and America to get rid of Nkrumah. Suzanne Williams, in her book White Malice, the CIA and the Neo-Colonization of Africa, quotes Britain's High Commissioner in Accra as saying, "It is in the interest of Britain that Nkrumah should cease to rule Ghana." And so the dirty tricks began. America worked to suppress the world price of cocoa, which was one of Ghana's major exports and revenue earners. Inside the country, the CIA was operating an anti-Nkrumah propaganda campaign, which worked so well that American Ambassador William Mahoney said in 1965, "Popular opinion is running strongly against Nkrumah, and the economy is in a precarious state." But Nkrumah was no deer in the headlights. He was playing his own game of chess. If the West were doing all they could do to undermine him, then he would make the enemy of his enemy his friend. In 1966, Nkrumah made a trip to China in an attempt to cement alliances between the growing power as well as with Russia. Sadly for Nkrumah, this chess move was his biggest mistake yet. While he was away, the CIA struck and, using their assets in and around Nkrumah, commenced a coup d'etat. John Stockwell, the former CIA man, said this: "Howard Bain, who was the CIA station chief in Accra, engineered the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. Inside the CIA, it was quite clear. Howard Bain got a double promotion and was awarded the Intelligence Star for the overthrow of Kwame. The magic of it was that Howard Bain had enough imagination and drive to run this operation without ever documenting what he was doing, and there wasn't one shred of paper that was generated that would name the CIA hierarchy as being responsible. And that, for Nkrumah, was all she wrote. He was stuck in China for a while before finding refuge in the Guinea Republic, another country in West Africa that was on the CIA's list for liberating. Now at this stage, you'd be forgiven for thinking Tro Black is pro-Nkrumah. Not entirely. Nkrumah was no angel. He was dictatorial. He passed laws ensuring that Ghana effectively became a one-party state. He fired judges whose judgments he didn't like. And quite likely, intoxicated with power and position, he might have gone on to be just another tin pot dictator. The point is, we'll never know. And that's not simply because he had dictatorial tendencies. That's because he was a threat to the dictators that were already in power, those across the Atlantic and those north of the Atlantic in Britain. Make no mistake, things took a turn for the worse under the governments that succeeded him. Corruption went stratospheric, the phrase human rights became a joke, and the economy went to the toilet. All this was so much so that one of the main coup plotters wrote less than a year after the coup that the irony of the present situation is that it is quite probable that President Nkrumah and the CPP would command the support of a majority of the electorate in genuinely free elections. It is a pity that it is not possible to test this hypothesis. But an even greater irony for the flawed hero of Ghana was that when Nkrumah famously and euphorically said, "At long last, the battle has ended," he didn't know it had just begun. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed our work, please like and share it, and help us grow our channel by subscribing for more interesting and informative content. All sources used are linked below if you need it. This is Trill Black, no doubt, reminding you to rep black right.
Cut the flight, then I touch the sky, and I cut the vibe, then I feel the high, then I feel the high, then I touch the sky. It's a real bad move when you sneak up on them, man.